Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Catholic Re.Con, Testimonies from Reverts and Converts. I'm your host, Eddie Trask, and this week's guest is Stephanie Thomason, also known as S.J. Thomason. Actually, some of you may have found some of her videos. She has a YouTube channel. I will share that in the description and additional information about Stephanie. I do want to give you a brief bio. She is a wife and mother of two teenage sons, and she says most importantly, a Christian who was born again in the faith in 2012 after a series of chance encounters and spiritual experiences, which we will get into. She teaches business management courses at a Florida university. In 2007, she earned a PhD in business admin with specializations in international management and human resource management. This is fascinating to me. Her academic research interests include ethical decision-making, personality, coaching, and experiential education. And Stephanie, first of all, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. I noticed that there was a site here that was listed. Where did it go? Do you still maintain isn't there a Christian apologetics website?
I do. I have a blog, and it's called Christian-apologist.com.
Perfect. Okay. I will make sure to include that in the description. So, Stephanie, I know you've been on a wild ride for many years. I know the listeners would love to hear where this all began.
Great. Well, it began in the Catholic Church, went to the Baptist Church, and I reconverted back to Catholicism. And it was a long journey, a very long journey. I was born in the Catholic faith. Both of my parents are Catholic. 3 of my grandparents were Catholic. And so it's something that's part of our tradition. And I went through Catholic grade schools, grade school, and then I went to a Catholic high school freshman year. But then I left that high school because it was an all-girls school, and I didn't really like that. I wanted to be at a co-ed school, so I ended up in a public high school and public colleges. And I had an experience with Mother Mary when I was in college, it was a real brief experience, but she just comforted me and opened my eyes, and I felt really good the next day. I had been panicking and really upset about something, and she sort of appeared to me at night and sat on my bed and comforted me. And I never forgot that, and I always gave her credit for that. But that comes in a little bit later when I started feeling pretty guilty about what happened. So then what happened was when I was just about to graduate from college at Florida State University. And I ended up kind of waffling away in my 20s. Everybody in my family was getting upset, except my sister, but everybody else was getting upset about some of the stuff going on in the Catholic Church at the time. And it was a challenging time for the church. And it's just at the time I was upset. I thought, well, they're not doing enough about all of this stuff that's going on. And so I started kind of just moving away and looking at New Age stuff, which is as crazy as that is. I was reading books by Deepak Chopra and The Celestine Prophecy by James Redfield and all this stuff, and Betty Eadie's Embraced by the Light. And I was looking at near-death experiences and sort of all over the place. And I spent my 30s, again, kind of all over the place, just looking at that. And Jesus was sort of tucked in the back, which isn't the place where he should have been. But I thought that was sort of the default. Born and raised in the United States, I just thought, well, Catholicism, Christianity, it's just the default. And I think this other stuff is much more interesting. And so I started looking into Eastern faiths and all that kind of stuff, and examining pantheism and thinking that they had some sort of superior nudge over Christianity and Catholicism, even more specifically. But then what happened was we moved over to Tampa, near Tampa, Florida, where I accepted this position. And my husband was able to get work over here too. And as my kids got a little bit older, my son said, how come everybody else is going to church on Sunday and we aren't? And I said, well, don't you think that's the perfect time to go to the public pool? No one's there. It's great. And he said, there's a pool in the neighborhood. And my husband, we were married in the Lutheran church because that was his background. And so I had a little bit of Lutheran stuff in me too, but I thought we thought, well, maybe we should start looking at churches around here, because he seemed like he really wanted to do that. My other son didn't really seem as interested, but the youngest one was really into that. And so we started looking around, and we went into a Lutheran church, and it was sort of in this little boxy building, and it didn't really strike us. And I remember complaining a lot, which isn't really good thing for a wife to be doing, but I was complaining. And so then we thought, okay, let's go to the Catholic Church. And we went to the Catholic Church, and I thought, I don't know, it seems so solemn. And I thought, I mean, I was looking for the church to give me something, which is totally the wrong attitude. So I go into this Baptist church and they're just singing like crazy. It's contemporary music. The pastor gets in, he starts going into the Bible, and I'm like, oh my gosh, he's digging into the Bible. This must be the real church I should be at. And so I stuck in there for 10 years. But then as I was in there, during this 10 years, at first it was super exciting. And I thought, this is great. I'm going to learn everything I can know about the Bible, because it didn't feel like I'd done that growing up. And so I started digging into the Bible and getting into apologetics. And I came up with that blog site, and I got on Twitter and I started talking to all these atheists and developing my faith and getting all this stuff going. But then after a while, I started missing things, and I started having questions. And I thought, wait a second. When the atheist says to me, hey, there's 40,000 different Christian denominations, how come you guys can't make up your mind? Until you make up your mind, why should we have to? And I thought, is there one that just has one person's central authority? That would be helpful. And then I thought, I kind of was looking at the fact that the church I was going to had created this basketball court / church that was a basketball court during the week and a church on the weekend. And I thought, at first I thought, oh, that's very thrifty of them. What a good move. And then after a while I thought, is that really what God wants us to do in his house, is to have it be a basketball court during the week? And wouldn't he want something much more magnificent? And I had been at the Piazza del Duomo in Milan, Italy, which is the most amazing Catholic Christian church I've ever seen in my life. And I thought, I think we're supposed to be awe-inspired at a church and not looking at basketball nets. I don't know, just so then but the biggest thing that got me was when I was online, I thought, I read Revelation 12 and I thought, well, that's Mother Mary. And I never really thought much of it, but then I read it again and again. And I kept thinking, the Protestants don't seem to revere Mother Mary. In fact, some of them seem to denigrate her. And so I got online and I looked at it. It says she's the Queen of Heaven who gave birth to the ruler of the world. And I thought, well, who is that? So I put that on Twitter. I said, who is this? Who is this describing? And I thought, it's going to be a shoe. And any Christian will say, well, that's Mother Mary. And they're all coming up with all of these other explanations. But for sure, to some of them, it could not be Mother Mary, no matter what. Couldn't be Mother Mary. And I thought, well, it's clearly Mother Mary. She could also be symbolic of Israel. She could also be a constellation. But clearly, the woman who gave birth is the mother of God. And then that also is another term they didn't like either. And so that really got me, because I had that experience. Yeah. And I'd also had some experiences after that, but I thought, that's it. I've got to, there's a number of other reasons, but that was one of the biggest ones that swooped me right back into the church.
What year was that you asked that question on Twitter?
That just happened this past summer.
What? I didn't realize it was that recent. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, it went super quickly. Once I started looking into the church, I can't tell you how fast everything moved, because everything, it was like this waterfall of all of this stuff that was coming together. I thought, we need the Eucharist. Why aren't we getting the Eucharist? We need to be able to confess our sins to somebody who's human, to be able to sort of tell us what God's answer would be. And so the confession thing was missing. The Eucharist every week was missing. I mean, even at the Lutheran church, you'd think they would give communion every week. They don't, not even on Christmas. In fact, I went to a Lutheran church this past Christmas because my mother-in-law, we went to stay with her and she wanted us to go to her church. And we went there and we went through this whole thing and there was no communion. And I said to my husband, where's the communion? Now we got to go make up for this. What are we doing? We got to go to church. We can't just have that.
Wow.
So, yeah.
So up until last summer, you were attending that same Baptist church, or was it a different, did you stay planted in that one? Because I know a lot of people, we've interviewed a lot of people that are bouncing from Baptist to, everything starts to kind of merge together and they all sort of believe the same things. Where were you?
I have to admit, here's what I have to admit. So I was attending church at the Baptist church at first quite a bit. I was involved. I was doing the children's ministry and I was teaching on what's it called? The Wednesday night thing. I'm forgetting what it's called all of a sudden. But I was doing all of that kind of stuff and I was very involved. And then I kind of fell off a little bit, especially around COVID, because I was afraid at COVID we couldn't attend. And so I started watching stuff online. And then my husband totally lost interest in attending the church. That church, he just wasn't interested. In fact, I just got him to come with me to the Catholic church just this past Sunday. This is the second time since I started going, and he actually liked it so much that he said, maybe we need to start going every week. And I've been going every week, but I want at least once a week. So I want him. So I'm very excited.
That's
So yeah, he fell off, and so he fell off, my kids fell off, and so then I started just watching it online, the Baptist church, and that was pretty lazy, and I would go in there once in a while, but I wasn't going as much as I should have been. And then as soon as I came back to the Catholic faith, I realized I started reading about the catechism. I started reading about how we're supposed to attend on Sunday. It's really pretty much a sin if you're not going every week. And so and of course, this past weekend, now that I looked into Mother Mary, I looked into the saints. The Protestants are ignoring all of these great saints and the Fatima and Lourdes and the Guadalupe experiences. And so I started looking into those and what the church approved. And I thought, okay, so there's the Feast of the Holy Sacred Heart on the first Friday. So I did that this past Friday. Then on Saturday, I realized it's the first Saturday for Fatima. So I had to go there and follow that process. And then Sunday, of course, I've got to be there on Sunday. So that's when I got my husband to come with me.
Yeah, so the richness was missing in a very real sense. And I feel that there are certain groups that I don't know if they would even investigate what you're talking about, because it just sounds so foreign compared to what they're accustomed to. So for instance, just saying apparition, many people are trained to think, oh man, the minute you say apparition, it must be demonic. But if you research, you can see the things that are not approved, the things that do not align with tradition. It's like, you can't just say that you heard of an apparition and like willy-nilly say, well, that is, they just accept it because someone in a field saw something. It's like, no, there's actually rigorous investigation. And so I do wish that more non-Catholic Christians would investigate the apparitions, specifically the approved ones, and think of the context, who was there, the eyewitnesses, in the sense of what Our Lady of Guadalupe. Read about the tilma. Just read about it. Don't fear it. Read about it. But go ahead. Was there anything else related to that transition? So you post this thing on Twitter about revelation, about Mother Mary, and you just said that was like this huge moment. Did you immediately start investigating all other possible objections? Because in my case, in my process of reverting, that was my first step. I said, whoa, something is right here. There's something that is worth investigating. And then my brain immediately went to all the objections that had come up while I was at a non-denominational church for 10 years. Similar to you.
That's the exact same.
Yeah.
That's 10 years. That is amazing. Yeah,
yeah.
So that's exactly what happened, because it's the similar thing. My son, the same son who said, why aren't we going to church, realized again, hey, Mom, why aren't we going to church? And I said, well, we've got to go to church, but you guys have to get up on Sunday morning. And I know you like to sleep in so much. And the Baptist church only had services twice on Sunday morning. They'd stop the Saturday night ones. And so I thought to myself, I went online and I looked up and the Catholic church, they've got services every single day and on Saturday at 4:30. So I thought, well, that's perfect. Why don't we start going to that? But then I thought, well, I don't really want to go to the Catholic church, because if I do, the doctrines, I mean, they're not right about Mother Mary. They think she was immaculate. Actually, I thought at the time that the Immaculate Conception was Jesus's Immaculate Conception.
A lot of people.
And so I hadn't even looked at that one, but I was the perpetual virginity was the big one, and that she was supposed to have brothers, or Jesus supposed to have brothers and sisters. Protestants taught me all about that. I wrote blogs about it. I made videos about how Mother Mary had sons and all this stuff. So I was totally entrenched into that idea. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to go and dig into this one, because if this is true, then it's behooves me to look at everything else. And so to start on that process, I actually looked at my patron saint, the one that I named when I was confirmed, which is Catherine of Siena. I know this sounds strange, but I looked at Catherine of Siena and I found that she had this dialogue with God. And she was sort of an illiterate woman. And what happened was she would go through these states of ecstasy and she would record what God was telling her. Another person would actually write it down. And the dialogue is written to such a high level extent that there's no way an illiterate woman could have possibly put these words together in such a beautiful way, if not somehow inspired by some higher power. And in that, God praised Saint Jerome. and St. Thomas Aquinas, and he mentioned a few others, but they were all saints. And so I thought, well, that's strange. When I wrote that one blog about Mother Mary and the brothers and all this stuff, it said that I was relying on Helvidius and his testimony, and Tertullian and a few other people who said that Mother Mary was not a perpetual virgin. And so then I thought, well, why am I relying on them when St. Jerome wrote a whole book against who he called a heretic called Helvidius, and that talked about her perpetual virginity, and these people who are named in the Bible as Jesus's cousins under Clopas, who's also called Alphaeus, and the other Mary. And so then I reread what was in the Bible about all of this through that different lens. And I thought, oh my gosh, wait a second, why am I pairing up with the heretic and not the saint? So that really opened my eyes.
Yeah. And it opened your eyes to, again, so if you said, if this is real, if this is true, did you say that then therefore everything else needs to be investigated? Because
Yes.
other people, there have been a few people that have said, if this is true, then these other things must be true. And if these other things must be true, then I've just accepted the entirety of tradition, Christian tradition, proclaimed by the Catholic Church. And they have that enormous epiphany.
That's where, and I did have that too, especially after that. After reading Jerome, I had a huge epiphany, and I thought, okay, I will look at what all of the other early church fathers said about this. I went back and read up on Ignatius and Justin Martyr and Irenaeus, and it was all supporting Mary's perpetual virginity, but it didn't say much about this Immaculate Conception. So I thought, well, I will look into that doctrine now. And so I thought, okay, here are, and I wanted to pull the PhD training that I had, because I can't just take something at face value. I've got to dig into the initial source, or at least some sort of support that can be justified. And so for the Immaculate Conception, it's a doctrine that came about by a pope in the 19th century that was official. But this is the thing. I thought, okay, well, I will look at where this came from. And so I started looking at it who did I find for the Immaculate Conception and the Assumption? Those are other two ones, but I was looking at older things on that kind of thing. But the better support that I found in recent times that I thought was pretty good, I think I can legitimize this, is looking at Our Lady of Lourdes for the Immaculate Conception. Because here, I actually watched that movie, the Bernadette, Song of Bernadette.
Yes.
But great movie. So I watched that, and we've got this little Bernadette who's also just a little, like a farm girl, who's also rather, she's not well-spoken or anything like that. She'd never heard of the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. And when she asked Mother Mary to identify who she was at this grotto, Mother Mary said, I am the Immaculate Conception. And the funny part, I have a rosary in this house that's this gigantic rosary from Lourdes that my grandmother got, and it says on it in French, it says Jesus Immaculate Conception on it. But she said that's who she was. And I found other confirmations from other saints. And so I thought, well, if the saints are confirming this, and saints are able to perform miracles, or there's a miracle attributed to these saints, like there's many miracles at Lourdes, and you have to go through an amazingly rigorous process to get a miracle approved at Lourdes. Something like 70 out of 7,000 people's claims on healings have been approved as miraculous healings at Lourdes. And so I looked at that story and I thought, well, I would lend her some credibility. And then I thought, here's another story, Our Lady of Saluva. Here she appears in, I think it was the 15th century, in Saluva in Lithuania, Mary, to these kids, and they're playing out there on this plot of land, and they're around this old church, and she's crying, and these kids come up to her and they're like, wondering why she's crying, and they didn't know, and then she disappeared. And so then they ran into the town and told people, oh my gosh, there's this woman, this beautiful woman who appeared in this place at Saluva. And so all these people, there was a Calvinist pastor, and apparently what happened was Saluva used to be a very Catholic place, and about 80 years before, so Calvinists knocked out the Catholics there and basically took over. And they took over this church, and they did all this kind of stuff. And the deed to the church had been buried underground by a Catholic priest who was trying to protect all of this from the Calvinists decades before. So then what happened was they were able to bring this pastor, this Calvinist pastor, and a bunch of people who were doubters over to this rock where Mary had appeared. And they were all standing there, and she appeared again. And at this time, the Calvinist pastor asked her, who are you? What's going on? And she directed him to, she said she was crying because she said, this is where my son's beautiful church was. and basically alluding that the Calvinist faith is also going down the wrong path. But anyway, so turns out the word got out, and the person who had worked with that priest to bury this beautiful picture of Mother Mary and the baby Jesus, and also bury this deed to the Catholic Church for this church, this blind person came out, found his way, like he was led over there. He said, I know what's going on. He was led over there. And as soon as he got to this site, his sight came back, and he was able to dig up where this thing had been buried. And so that's why Siluva, S-I-L-U-V-A, is celebrated so much. So there's some really neat apparitions that have appeared with miracles associated that give credence to Mother Mary's authenticity of Catholicism.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. So did authority, I guess at that point, you're, by affirming the saints, you're affirming the apparitions, the miracles, you're also by virtue affirming the authority. So at that point, was authority, did it become pretty clear to you that everything is, as I like to say, if you're going to go upstream, a lot of these groups that claim authority start to fall away. You just keep going upstream into history. And then you're left with, well, of course, Eastern Orthodoxy, Coptic or Ethiopian Orthodoxy, and other forms of orthodoxy that don't necessarily affirm the papacy. Did that become anything that you explored as far as, okay, I get the authority, but it's still kind of nebulous? Where is the true authority? Not just conciliar authority, but who leads the earthly church? Did that come to you?
Yeah, that definitely came in, because first thing I also looked at, there's a couple other things that I looked at, but definitely the papacy was big. And I don't want to forget, I cannot forget also looking at the sola fides idea either, and sola scriptura. But because I was ingrained with that idea through my Baptist faith. It was sola fides, sola scriptura. But before that, it's interesting because coincidentally, I was in St. Augustine, because we live in Florida, as you know, and I was in St. Augustine last year. It was I think it was March, with my in-laws, and we decided to stumble into this little Greek Orthodox. It was kind of like a church or a museum. I think it was more of a museum, but I think it was just a museum. And we stumbled in there, and this woman I was very interested in buying a cross from them because I just love the crosses. And so I wanted to have this cross necklace. And so I was in there, and she said, are you interested in Greek Orthodoxy? And I said, sure, I'll look into that. I don't really know much about it. And so she handed me this little booklet called Behold Thy Mother. And in the booklet, it had this little piece of paper that traced the church and how in 1054, it traced it all, called the Holy Catholic Church, down this timeline. And then in 1054, it broke. And then it had these little pictures of splinters that started in 1517 with Martin Luther. And of course, John Calvin, and all these other splinters. So it's like this tree just broke off, and the way it was pictured. But the way she did it was, the way they did it, I should say, was the Holy Catholic Church, suddenly the same straight line turns into the Holy Orthodox Church, and the Catholic Church broke off according to theirs. And so I thought, interesting, but I just took it with a grain of salt, and I didn't really think much of it. But so then I thought, okay, well, now which one has legitimacy here, the Greeks or the Catholics? I'm going to look into this. And so I thought to myself, well, it all goes back to Jesus. What did he say? And he stood in front of Peter, and he named Peter the rock, Cephas, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail. And Peter was buried where he was crucified in St. Peter's Basilica, which just happens to be right there at the Vatican. So the church is built on top of the Vatican. So when they broke off in these other churches in Constantinople and other places, they were not at the central authority where Jesus had given the authority to Peter, and where the succession of apostolic priests came about. And so I think that gives the Pope a lot of legitimacy. And plus the other churches they both have the ecumenical councils. They have all this kind of stuff that happened in the 5th and 6th centuries and that sort of thing. But starting with Trent and these other things, Mother Mary is not making appearances over in these other churches quite the same way, at least as far as I know. I haven't heard it at all, as she is to the Catholic Church, such as Our Lady of Siluva and Lourdes and Fatima. And there's all kinds of miracles coming with these. And so I think she's giving legitimacy to the Catholic Church. And I think it's a good idea. Here's what I'll show you. I have in my pocket here. It's a really good idea. Oh, you can't see this. I should turn this off. Can you see that little pocket rosary?
You can see it. Yep.
Yep. I have a rosary, a whole one, but I also have this little pocket rosary. And if you're interested Catholic, trace your history. My history goes into Ireland and into Germany, and my grandparents were Catholics in those areas. And look at the fights that they had to put up with to maintain the Catholic faith against the Protestants. And to carry a pocket rosary was illegal for a long time in Ireland. You could be killed if you were found with that. And so this has historical significance. And so there's a lot of cool stuff. And they had pocket rosaries only because you could see the full one. The pocket one you could hide because it only has a decade on it.
Wow.
And so
yeah.
There's some cool stuff out there that there's a great history. You really should look into it and look at all of this stuff. If you have great grandparents and grandparents who are in the Catholic faith, look at what they've gone through to fight for that. And you'll be probably, I felt kind of mad that I left. And my mom passed away in February. And someone on Twitter said, do you think that might have had something to do with your seeking out Mother Mary after your mom passed away? And I thought, I don't know, but maybe my mom has something to do with it up there. Like,
who knows?
Hey,
who knows? Absolutely.
Help her out, Mom.
Yeah, I think when you mentioned the witness of the saints and Mother Mary appearing, there was one of the best blogs. It was an article. I cannot find it. This gentleman was explaining why he was not Eastern Orthodox, and he had a number of points, but one of them was this continual witness of the saints and the story, and like reading about, back to my point about just investigating. I think he was talking about how he started reading about all these saints, and he was able, not only the continuity or the succession, the apostolic succession and the continuity of the popes, et cetera, but also this continuity of saints, he said, was undeniable. Mm-hmm. That through every period in history, you had these phenomenal documented witnesses that were affirming the Catholic faith. Jesus Christ, of course, not to be confused. People will say it's not about the religion. It's like, you don't understand what this body means, but he was making it very clear. He said these phenomenal witnesses, disciples of Christ, carry all the way through, and it's all under the same heading. I affirm Catholic dogma, Catholic doctrine. Yeah. I am the Lord's. And I thought that was just a phenomenal article. I wish I could find that again.
I think that's really valuable. And I think that, because that's another question I had. I said, well, now, why are Catholics praying to the rosary? And I needed to know why Catholics are praying to the rosary. So I found this book by Don something, and I'm forgetting I'll get his last name in just a second, but he wrote a book. Actually, at first I watched a video that he did, and so that got my attention to this person. But he traced it back to St. Dominic, and even before St. Dominic, and that was around, I think if I remember correctly, it was around in the 1100s, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe the 1000s, in the thousands. I'm not exact. I have to look that up exactly when that was. But Mother Mary appeared to him and gave him the rosary and told him how to say that. And so that was very early on, right around the time of the schism. But before that, we also had people using beads to remember, like they were saying prayers. And so they'd use these beads, and then she showed them this particular prayer. And then it kind of grew from that. And so, yeah, like you say, St. Catherine of Siena came around not too much longer after that. We've got a long succession of saints, Padre Pio in our more recent times. There are all these saints who have affirmed the Catholic Church, Lourdes, Fatima. And you say to yourself, well, what does the Catholic Church do? Are they just willy-nilly declaring people saints? Is there a process? Like, why hasn't Sister Lucia been called a saint yet from Fatima? Her two peers have been determined that were a saint. And it's because she had a really long life. They have to examine every single facet of her life to make sure she didn't somehow do something wrong during her life, fall away from it. Anything like this couldn't have happened. There has to be a miracle attributed to her. There's got to be, and there has, you could probably say that with what happened at Fatima, I'm sure, because people's sight was coming, they're able to walk, all this kind of good stuff. But there's a very, very difficult process one has to follow to be a saint. And the Catholic Church has really laid that down. And I think that's significant. And I got one more for you that you might not have even, I think this is amazing. I listened to this guy do you listen to Chad Ripperger?
Father? Yeah. Father? Yeah.
I love that guy. He's because he does exorcisms. Yeah. And he talks in a very no-nonsense way about this crazy stuff, exorcisms. People think it's crazy. And so he says he's got these stories, but apparently, and this is, you wonder to yourself, you say, now, why is it that the Catholic Church is successfully performing the exorcisms? And somehow, a lot of times you hear these other pastors are out there and they're attempting and they're not successful. And Ripperger said it's because the demons know it's the Catholic Church actually has the authority to perform the exorcisms. These other ones do not. They're like counterfeit authorities. And so they don't pay them any heed. They don't pay attention to them. So some guy on Twitter said, hey, how come I can be trained by the Catholic Church even if I'm not a priest? I said, well, no, because you won't have the priestly authority if you're not a priest to perform these exorcisms.
Yeah. And it's an odd thing, but the people that do believe in the Protestant faith, that they can go almost toe to toe in that realm, is very scary. And I remember someone mentioning this. They're like, if you think of any movie where there's this demonic force, inevitably someone will say, who's going to call the priest?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of truth to that. If you're battling something of possession, and it's so funny to get the charge, you guys are demonic. We'll take that on as Catholics. We'll hear this anti-Catholic rhetoric. And I always think about, okay, the priests are the ones that have the authority. And that's, and the charge of the church to bind and loose. That's very unique.
That's huge.
Yeah, it's huge.
Yeah, like Peter was given that charge, and that goes back to Isaiah. So it's pretty neat how it kind of all wraps back into the Bible about binding and loosing and the authority and the key to heaven.
Exactly. So I don't even know where we left off. What were the, I guess, final steps to return to the Catholic Church? What did that look like as far as even from a perspective of the Eucharist, the reconciliation, etc.?
That's a big one. So what happened was, it was back in August, and I decided, okay, I'm going to go try the Catholic Church. I'm going to do a little sampling, and it was early August, but I had to teach these classes. I had these 2 weekend warrior back-to-back classes for an EDB, executive doctorate program, and the executive MBA program. So I wasn't able to go on these 2 Sundays, but I went just before that, and I thought, this is perfect. This is great. I went in there, and it was a Sunday afternoon. It was 5:30, and they had this service where they had just a little teeny bit of contemporary music. So it brought me to my Baptist thing. They sang that my favorite song from Matt Redman's, I think it was the 10,000 Reasons, or it was Chris Tomlin. It was one of those two that they sang that I was relating to. And I thought, oh, this is wonderful. So that was what I was looking for at that time, the song, more than I was looking for the Eucharist. I wasn't totally into that quite yet. And then what happened? So I had to take off 2 weeks, and then I went back, and I tried to convince my husband. Nobody wanted to come back with me. So I'm like, okay, I'll go back. And I went back, and I loved it again. So I went home, and I said, you have to come with me. They're following this really interesting process. They've got it all planned out, where the first half hour we do this, then starting right at the top of the hour, we're starting to work on the Eucharist. There's a whole process. It's really exciting. And there's the whole pomp and circumstance when the priest comes out and everybody's carrying the cross, and it seems really neat. And I feel like I missed that. And they said, well, my son came with me, and he liked it. He's like, this really seems like how it should be, Mom. It seems much more formal. Like, this is more godly. And I thought, yeah. And so he hasn't come with me always, and my husband came with me once. He's come with me a handful of times, which is good. So at least we're starting to get things going. We want to get the whole 4 of us. There's 4 of us in the family to go. But every time I go, it seemed better and better. And so by late September, at the 3rd week of September, I said, I've got to do the confession. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is going to be ugly, because I had to confess since I was 13. So I've got decades of sins like piled up there. And I thought, so I get to the confession thing, and I'm waiting in the chapel, and I'm behind all these people. And I think to myself, and everybody seemed to be taking 5 minutes. And I thought, how am I going to cover all of these sins in 5 minutes? Because clearly the priest does not have all day. It would take weeks probably, because I have my 20s, I have to deal with college, there's all this stuff. And so I thought, how am I going to do this? So I thought, I will just group it under all of the deadly sins, which pretty much, I didn't kill or do anything like that. I didn't commit murder, or actually the 10 commandments I'm pretty good with. I didn't have those kind of problems, but I have all these venial sins and all these other things that I was doing. I'm selfish sometimes, pride, avarice, all that kind of stuff. So I thought, I will just group them all under those ugly sins. And I will say I've done all of them, and I will cite some examples. And then I would ask for forgiveness for the ones I felt were particularly egregious. And then he handed me the Magnificat of Mary, which says that every generation is going to bless. He handed me a little piece of paper, and that was how I was supposed to. I read that, and I thought, do the Protestants even know this is in the Bible? Because I don't remember ever having a sermon with the Magnificat, which is an amazing thing that she said. I think it's in the Gospel of Luke.
That's right. Wow. So what about attending? I guess, were you by yourself when you finally received the Holy Eucharist, or were there?
I received it each time, because as I went back, I just decided, okay, I'm a Catholic. I know that sounds unorthodox and I shouldn't have done that, but I went back and decided I'd receive because I had received communion in the Baptist church. I had converted to the Baptist faith. I was baptized again a second time. That's why I said I was born again. I need to update that little bio that you read, by the way, to talk about the Catholic thing. I guess I haven't done that yet.
I knew what you meant. I mean, so much of this is you are on the journey. So and ecumenism is real. There are people that are crossing over that are, what you said about the music, that is very real. I think a lot of people need to hear that music happened to touch you in that moment, and it was a big deal.
So I wrote
not to say, everything should be like that, but there are very real triggers. I've talked about this before. When the senses are engaged like that, you have no idea what's going to pop into your head and cause you to say, what am I? This is it for me. I'm home, or whatever it is.
That's what it was.
Yeah.
That's what it was. And so I actually did my video there, and I also wrote it in a blog. I haven't posted the whole thing in the blog. I split it up a little bit in different blog pieces, because I've got a bunch of Protestants follow me on that blog. So I'm wondering if I should actually switch and make a Catholic blog that's pure Catholic, and I would call it the Catholic Value Proposition, because I'm also thinking about doing a new YouTube channel, adding on to call it the Catholic Value Proposition, to just dig into all things Catholic, so the Protestants don't go crazy and just get really mad at me. But
I like the name of that, though. Catholic Value Proposition. That is good.
It's a business term.
Exactly. Of course. Unique value proposition is absolutely crucial. So,
but that's what I was so excited about that service, and we call it service in the Protestant faith, but it's really the Mass. I was so excited about that one with the music. So I wrote I've actually written a book. It's all on the Catholic Value Proposition, but I don't know if I'm going to publish that before. I mean, I might just leave it till I've perfected a little bit, and then first hand it off to some family and friends and see what they think of it. But in that book, I told the whole story. And I took the chapter that I wrote about this whole experience with the music and everything, and I sent it to the 3 priests at the Catholic Church. And 2 of them didn't respond, because they probably get tons of mail, but one of them did. And he wrote me, Father Izzy, and he wrote me back, and he said, this is so exciting. He said, a lot of it is the Eucharist. And I thought, the Eucharist? Yeah, that's pretty important too. So I thought to myself, wait a second, we don't get and I already realized that, because I knew it. The Baptist church, we only get the Eucharist every 3 months. So, and they don't call it the Eucharist, they call it communion. So we only
now that's an interesting point. How do they administer communion? I know that does vary from denomination to denomination.
It does. So what they do is everyone gets a little cup, like it's a little teeny cup of grape juice. Yeah. And you have a little thing in front of your seat where you put the cup. It's into this little hole, and you stick it in there when you're done. And what they hand us they hand it down the row. They come to the rows and they hand down a cup and a little piece of bread to each person. And then you sit there and you wait for a certain time, and then everybody eats the bread and drinks the cup and puts it down. But it's not, you don't go up to the altar. It's different. Like the Lutheran church, you go up to the altar. It's very similar. And so, but the Catholic church sort of even has it down. Like when we went to Christmas this past Christmas, and we went to the Lutheran church for my mother-in-law, as I said before. Yeah. So we went there, and my mother-in-law is a very devout Lutheran. And so she's a devout Christian woman. She's an amazing woman. I love her. Like she's a big reason why I came back. I know her prayers getting us to come back to the church a long time ago. She was the one who did that. But so we went to to honor her, we went to the service at the Lutheran church. And here's how it was. So this is the Christmas service. In the first place, everyone in this church is just beautiful. I'm telling you, it looks like supermodels. It's down to Boca Raton, but it's just beautiful people, all these like gorgeous people. And so we're all in this church and looking around, and they're singing contemporary music for about 40 minutes. And then the pastor gets up there and he has a really good sermon. And then all of a sudden he's like, okay, everybody, service is ended, go in peace, something like that. And so we got up and I'm like, oh my gosh, Keith, we're not getting communion today. What happened? He's like, oh, we don't have time for that. We don't have time for that. It's like, yeah, there's just not going to be enough time. And I noticed that the Catholic Church, they're so incredibly efficient that they have somebody on each row that can administer the communion. So it's, no matter how many people are in the pews, it's about a 5-10 minute process. It's a very quick process. And so that's, it's just highly efficient. So there's not a half hour, I guess, that maybe they think it's going to take or something, but yeah, so we didn't get communion.
Yeah, it just makes me think, interviewed someone that was a former Anglican, and the final straw for the family was they went to a service. I don't remember if it was a Christmas, I don't know. But someone just said, standing room only, there's no room. Or they may have even said you need to be outside or something. Whatever that was, it just makes me think of what you're saying. It's like, okay, we're out of time. Even if that wasn't said, it's like, why do we gather? And of course, that question is going to, the way you answer that question is going to tell you where your theology comes from. At what point in history did your theology develop? Because if you naturally say, we're here to sing songs and worship the Lord, and then if you say, well, what about communion? What about do this in memory of me? Depending on how people answer that, that's going to show where their theology developed, and what does it mean to come together as a body? What should that look like? And I think those questions drive a lot of people to look at the early church. And in fact, a lot of Protestants will say, I've heard this so many times, this is getting so confusing. This denomination wants to do it this way. This guy's launching something over here. There's a church plant over here. Let's just make it easy and go back in time. But my theory is that a lot of people will leapfrog. They'll take the Protestant theology, go back to the early church and start to mix those together and say, we got it, versus go all the way through, if that makes sense. So I've heard a number of people say, let's make it easy. This is too convoluted. Let's go back and see how they did it in the early church. But again, if you're apart from, if you take the Protestant lens with you, then maybe you can, I guess, justify a new type of service. I know that there are people that have modern day services that look more Jewish than Christian, which is fascinating.
That is, and just to talk about going back in time and doing things like that, is the thing about the Catholic Church that I find fascinating is when you go back in time, you can see that they've taken the time in all of these councils to hammer out the big doctrinal issues. The early church fathers spent a vast majority of their time hammering out against heretical views. So, I mean, you can see it from the very beginning. The heretics were out there trying to fight it. And every single book they're writing is against heresies. You've got against Celsus, against Helvidius. I mean, they spend their whole time writing about these heretical views. And here we are, modern day, and we've got a bunch of heretical views out there. Once saved, always saved, the Trinity. They're very confused about the Trinity in some of these other denominations. They've got all of these views. And the Catholics have spent 2,000 years hammering out doctrines, talking to each other, praying, conferring through the saints. They're doing all of this stuff to try to get the message right. And every time I've looked back to see, okay, well, what should I think about this? Like I was thinking, I had just done a will this past summer, just before this whole thing. And in my will, I had that I was going to be cremated, and my husband decided that he was going to be dumped into the ocean. That's like the end of our life. Like he wanted to be put in a casket and have the casket set out at sea, so the kids could pray they could go and pray at a certain place at sea, and he would be there. And then I said I would save them all money, and you could cremate me and sprinkle me around in the sea. But then I thought, wonder what the Catholics think about that. They've probably given this some thought. And so I looked at it, and that's not what That is not going to fly.
You've probably given this some thought. I love that. Exactly.
So I had to redo that. I'm going to change that. So I'm like, oh, if I'm cremated, which I think that's actually not ideal. So now I'm thinking about, okay, I actually really should look at a graveyard and where this graveyard can be, and I need to be buried, because that's pretty much what's been the history. And
Well,
so,
yeah, and it comes down to the reverence for the body and the dignity of the body and things like that.
exactly.
If you didn't have a chance to, you need to look up Eternal Rest. It's a documentary that Augustine Institute just put out just on All Souls Day. Eternal Rest, the 4-part series. If your local parish has Formed, if you've heard of Formed, you need to get that and check it out, because that series addresses all things related to death and dying, and it's incredible.
I'm just taking a note of that. I want to say 2 other things before I forget that relate to this. Purgatory makes a lot of sense, and I always knew purgatory made a lot of sense, because I felt like what C.S. Lewis even agreed, that purgatory makes a lot of sense, because we do need this cleansing process, and it's also in the Bible. It just depends on, of course, when you have these multiple interpretations of these biblical passages, you can deny that there's purgatory there, but it makes a lot of sense that we need to cleanse. We can't just go to heaven with our dirty little selves, and there has to be a process.
Yeah, and even the scripture verses that will talk about, okay, you are born again, and then this idea of perseverance. Well, what is perseverance? Why would you need to persevere if you're perfectly righteous and completely white, as many will say, you're covered in his righteousness? Well, what does that working out your salvation look like? With fear and trembling, and many other verses. So again, in context, and again, in part with tradition, you can see how these things, they naturally fit together. You don't.
Yeah.
I noticed that there's a lot that might seem, okay, how do I put this? To a Protestant looking at a Catholic, they might say, well, that's just convenient because you have to find what fits your theology. And I'd say, well, no, you can see that the tradition on top of that is what brings it all together, versus shoehorning a modern theology into the Bible that has no historic backing. Or if it has historic backing, that timeline certainly runs out as you go time. And so that's what I'd say. We could charge each other all day about shoehorning this or shoehorning that, but again, it's still going to be the issue of, okay, by what authority?
Yeah, and it's also, I look at, it makes a lot of sense to me with purgatory, because here's the thing, you have 3 options. Jesus said you're either for him or against him. Okay, so that puts you into 2 camps. And if you're against him, that's not going to be really good for you. You're pretty much going to end up in the 3rd option, which is where you don't want to go. You want to avoid that. But if you're for him, meaning that you're not actively against him, you're just kind of out there. You haven't railed up against Jesus. You're just maybe an apathetic person. You've been trying to do good things and that kind of thing. But you do maybe need this purgatory option where you die and you're going to go through this process. And at that point, at final judgment, those in purgatory are going to see, well, now are you for him or against him? Where are you at this point? And so I feel like that's something that just makes a lot of sense. And it also explains this period of the saints. Now the saints are the ones who have it made. They die, they go to heaven. And so you either die, go to heaven like a saint, you die, go to purgatory, and that's a process, or you die and you go to hell, which is not where you want to go, because you don't get recalled out of hell. Unfortunately, there's no second chance down there. So that's
yeah. I think of, be perfect as my Father in heaven is perfect. He's not saying you are perfect like my Father in heaven is perfect. It's me, it's a call, it's a charge. So with all the grace, you're still going to have these attachments to the world. And our whole journey is to remove those attachments so that we get closer and closer to full charity and closer to Christ by virtue of that, obviously. So, yeah.
And the other, I also want to mention, just to throw it out there, the deuterocanonical books. So as a Protestant, I was taught that we have 66 books of the Bible, and I thought that we've always had 66, and that's what the Masoretic text came up with the Jewish people a long time ago and all that kind of stuff, and the Jewish only had 39 Old Testament books. And then I thought, well, why do the Catholics have 73 books? Maybe we should examine that. And so I went in and I saw some Protestants said that the Catholics added on these books. So that, well, why would the Catholics add on these books? And so I dug into that a little bit, and I realized that there are three different Jewish sects back in Jesus's time. So there's the Essenes, and the Essenes had the multiple books, which the Greek Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church have used. So the 73 books, the Greek actually has a few more, but they have this larger group of books, and the Essenes again are the Dead Sea Scrolls authors. And so they had all of these books. Then you had the Josephus type who thought the canon was closed in the 5th century BC. And he would have been the one who had been part of the Pharisee group that might have said, okay, we just have the 39 books. And then there was a third group, the Sadducees, and the Sadducees, I can't remember what they were thinking, but there are three different groups who had three different views at that time. But it turns out that in early times, many of the Jewish people, the Essenes and these others, were looking at all of these other books, and First Maccabees, Second Maccabees, all of those kind of books have doctrines in them that are consistent with Catholic doctrines that Martin Luther just found inconvenient. And so when they talked about works being important, and when they talked about purgatory, Martin Luther thought, I really don't like these. I don't like James. I don't like Revelation. I don't like Hebrews. All of these are inconvenient to my sola fides and sola scriptura ideas. And so why don't we go ahead and just remove all of what he called the deuterocanonical. He said St. Jerome thought that they were good, but they weren't necessarily at the exact same level of some of the other scriptures. And so he pulled out some of the books and relegated some of the other ones. He was hoping that James would be removed too, because he, of course, talked about faith without works is dead. So that's really inconvenient to sola fides.
Yeah, that was the famous Epistle of Straw to Luther.
Yes.
And then people will say, well, that was a certain point. He said that earlier on. And I'd say, if anyone is referring at any point in their lives to a recognized book of the Bible as an epistle of straw, you've got to take a look at it. And you've got to understand what would drive someone to say that. Is there a fundamental doctrine? Because why would you care? Why would you start to question whether or not something belongs in canon if you don't already have a theological vantage point that says this is truth? And if it doesn't fit, again, you then take your interpretation of that book and say, doesn't quite match with what I was expecting to see from this inspired text. And then if you say inspired text, you start to just it gets a little tricky if you're going to say it's the sole rule of faith, and yet some of it's open for debate. And then you start questioning who even brought us these books. And then you go back and you affirm only certain portions of the text and then just completely dismiss others. So
yeah. And that's exactly what they did. So that happened in 1517. And then I found there's a society in the United Kingdom that was Biblical Society, and they decided it was too expensive to retain the additional 7 books. So they got rid of them officially. And that's why the English translations have these 66 books. But if you look, even in some Jewish traditions, if you look in Ethiopia, for example, they have the larger set of books. And so there are some groups who still retain the larger sets. And so it's just something worthwhile. It's a lot of times too, we're thinking about our English translations and not thinking about the way that this is played out in other parts of the world.
Exactly. Great point. Is there anything else, Stephanie? I know our time is coming to an end here. That it's so cool to see how recent that was. I did not know that this just happened. Is there anything else you want to add to those that are listening? Anything that would be beneficial?
I do. I want to say something. When I was raised a Catholic, and I feel like I need to repent for some of the things that I said about the Catholic Church in my years as a Baptist, because I thought, oh, the Catholic Church, Catholics don't study the Bible. This is my initial thoughts, because I didn't study the Bible when I was young. Or Catholics don't do this because I didn't do this. And so a lot of these things I was attributing to the whole church, which maybe it was more specific to either me or my parish. And so what was really good for me that also happened over the past 5-6 years is I started finding online people like Jimmy Akin and Trent Horn. In fact, his book, Trent Horn, was one of the ones that really put me over the edge. I'm on his channel now, and he's on my channel, which is really great, his book on Catholicism. But I've been listening to Brant Petrie for years, and I've been listening to Bishop Barron, Robert Barron. And when I realized there's an intellectual side to Catholicism, that took away my little silly theory that, oh, the Catholics don't really get into the Bible. No, that was my fault. And so I just wanted to mention that. Look at the intellectual stuff on this if you're interested. I know you are, but for others.
No. Well said. It's so true. I think it's so easy for us to take a parish example and then apply it to the entire church without thinking.
Mm-hmm.
But for those of us that now know that that's an error, then we should all be willing to repent of that. That's a very strong point. Stephanie, I want to thank you for, again, your witness, your time. I like that we were able to explore a number of avenues that are natural in the process, I should say, from being Protestant to Catholic. And even for reverts like you, like me, you have to go on that same journey that many Protestants have to, cradle Protestants to be more specific, to make sure you understand how are these objections handled? Where did this text come from? Who are the early church fathers, et cetera, et cetera. So again, thank you. And everyone, please share this and like it and subscribe. And until next time, take care and God bless.